Welcome to the Catalyst Sale Podcast. Whether you are a sales professional, not in sales but interested in helping people solve problems, or a founder CEO who is looking to grow your business, you'll find practical tools, stories, and experience you can apply to your role. This week, Mike Simmons, the founder of Catalyst Sale, is going to talk to Ted Bauer. Ted is an organizational structure and culture expert, independent consultant, and a blogger. So let's get to work with Mike Simmons and Ted Bauer.
Ted, it is awesome to have you on the Catalyst Sale podcast. Thanks for being able to join us.
Ditto, man. I appreciate the offer. We've been trying to set it up for a little while, so I'm glad we finally got the opportunity to do it.
Yeah, and all of our interaction to this point has been through Twitter. A lot of back and forth in Twitter, a lot of engagement. You put some interesting content out there. What drives you when you start asking some of these questions, or you ask people to provide a hot take on Twitter? What's the catalyst for that?
I think the main thing, honestly, is that just around stuff with work, and it takes different forms, but stuff with work or tangential to work, I've always felt like I was the only one that felt a certain way. And that's a real cool aspect of social media, that you can put ideas out there and see people are feeling the same way. So I know we have a lot of discussions and academic research around like the paradoxical part of social media is that it's actually probably increasing isolation in some ways, even though it's a connective device. But where you see the connection is when you start putting out ideas that you have and seeing that there are other people that do agree with them. And then also, like, it's totally cool to hear from people that think you're completely full of garbage or whatever, because then it can change your worldview on some stuff. So honestly, I do a lot of stuff just to like kind of try to initiate a discussion or, find how people are thinking about an issue. I think when I was early stage social media, I was more about kind of like blasting out like links related to stuff that I do. And then over time, I figured that was kind of useless. So it became more about just trying to get people's opinions and feedback on stuff. So yeah, that's like how I try to use it now.
So as you go through this kind of progression and you start with looking at different ways that you use social media and you see all of this engagement, what are some topics that tend to get the most activity from your perspective? Where do you get an audience that really engages, or where do they say, wow, I want to be part of this discussion?
Most engagement, I would say, is around like flaws related to work or universal evils of like a white collar existence, like stuff around meetings or just like micromanagement, going through process for the sake of process. So kind of like those universal experiences. I do think that some of the more like emotional narrative content too, when you talk about like situations in your own life, failures in your own life, that is paradoxical too, because people generally teach you not to do that on social media. But when you do it, you are going to see a higher rate of engagement because, like I said, we were talking about this before we started recording, but everybody has their own set of struggles, whether that's professional, personal. And a lot of people are trained via social norm or their mentors or whatever, like not to talk about it. So when they see somebody putting stuff like that out there and they have felt it or been in those moments, I think that resonates too. So that was something that took me. I probably initially had a Twitter account in like 2009, 2010. And I probably only really started doing more like personal stuff in pockets in like 2017. So that's like about 7-8 years. And it took me forever to even like get to that place, but you do see engagement around that stuff periodically. So I think those are kind of like universal evils of like work process, and then like the more personal narrative stuff are kind of the two buckets where you see the most engagement.
So if we've got these universal evils from a work process perspective, why do they continue to be universal evils?
Man, that's a great question. And I've wondered that I guess I'm 37 now, and I've wondered that probably for like the whole time I've been working. So even if you believe in Darwinianism or Darwinism, I guess, you would think, since a lot of us know like this is a bad manager or this is a bad sales process or this is a bad meeting, you would think those things would evolve out because with time, the things that are good and right would replace them. So it feels like that happens societally, but not in a work context. And I saw like a TEDx London with some professor once about this. And he was kind of saying like bad process or bad approaches to work are kind of like a virus within the system of an organization, but it's like almost equivalent to cancer in the sense of like we can't really fully solve it. More advanced types of cancer, that is.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like I've always wondered that. I think it's that when you get to a certain level in an organization in terms of number of people, you just have too many personalities and like needs and wants and conflicts for it to be sensibly managed out. So, and we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, but like control and relevance are very important in a work setting. So not everybody is going to become a CEO. Not everybody is going to become a SVP of a Fortune 100 company. Most people are not going to become those things. So you need to define success along some parameter. A lot of people will define it by like, I feel relevant in this job, or I have control over this thing. And too often decisions emanate from that instead of emanating from a place of productivity or like, this would be good for the business. And I think that's why some of this negative stuff doesn't cycle out, you know?
Yeah, I mean, imagine that. So what you're talking about is relevancy. We want to make an impact.
Right.
Like I want to be relevant in my house. Right? I've got a 13-year-old and a 16-year-old, and then I've got my wife in the house and the dog, and I don't know exactly where I sit on the hierarchy side inside the house, but I want to be relevant. I want to make an impact, and I want to make an impact with the customers that we work with. And when I was an employee inside an organization, I wanted to make an impact inside that organization. I wanted to do good for others, do good for our customers. So it seems like these are human things where as human beings, we want to feel like we make an impact and we want to be part of something that's bigger than ourselves. So why do we overcomplicate this stuff?
Right. That's another great question. So I think, first tier of that answer to me is I think there are a lot of people within organizations who they're really afraid of like things going wrong or balls dropping or whatever, because that can have negative impact on them. So for whatever reason, a lot of human brains, I'm not like this, but a lot of people are. A lot of people want to create this multi-step process to ensure kind of like what surgeons do or airline pilots do, or even assembly workers for automobiles. Now, these are jobs that are like deeply tied to human safety. And a lot of the jobs are checklist driven, process driven, and that's good. And I think we kind of have a tendency to get to as close to 0% error as possible. We have a tendency to kind of like introduce these multi-tiered processes that introduce complexity. And like complexity on face is not a bad thing. There are certain situations that need to be managed in a complex way for sure. I do think there's a lot of times in white collar where like something will happen around documentation or execution on a deliverable, and it does not need to be like a 12-tier, 12-step process, but someone will introduce that because in the past something got screwed up with it. So I think we kind of gravitate towards these like super safety, purpose-laden professions and how they do things to minimize risk and error. So that's one tier of it. I also just think it does go back to a degree of control. Because, for example, like this is a very micro example, but if you've ever worked on an organization's website being redone, is like you will see like such an exercise in unnecessary complexity. I worked on one with one of my friends. He was designing it and I was doing content. It was for like a 500-person company. And at one point, they got to like 108 things off the nav. So there were like 9 navs and each of them had like 12 drop downs. And we were like, what in the heck is going on with this project? But the thing is like everybody that owns some like functional unit wants their functional unit to have some real estate there, because that ties to their relevance, like we were just talking about. So there's a lot of psychological things at play that I think lead to overcomplication inherently, where simplicity would be a much more logical concept. Final thing I would say on that is, I guess I read it, I may have watched it, but like Mary Barra, who's the CEO of General Motors, or at least was for a while, she gave a commencement, I want to say 2016, I want to say it was like Stanford Business School. And she told the people there, students there, if you end up running businesses, the worst thing you can do is create a business where it becomes painful for people to get the simplest thing done. And like, if you watch that speech, like almost everybody has worked at least one place in their life that fits that description, where it's like completely painful to get the simplest task done. So I think it is this huge kind of like blight on like work in general. And whenever you see like Gallup or Pew stats or whatever, like, oh, all these people are disengaged, it's like, I don't think we inherently dislike working. I don't know if you want to bring the Bible into it or whatever, but I don't think we dislike the idea of working. I think most of us realize we have to. I think it's just like, who wants to work at a place where like to get a document updated requires like 12 tiers of permission, you know? So that I feel like is kind of like a lot of the problems with work kind of come from that issue that we kind of like talk around it, but not about it a lot of the time.
Yeah. So in your experience, at what level does this start to happen in an organization? When they get to a certain size, when does this start to unravel?
I would say like north of about 20, but you could probably take it up to 50 or so. There's Bain Capital research from a couple of years ago that when you get to $5 billion in valuation, there's usually 14 to 17 layers between the CEO and the lowest level person. So whether you want to say that's like a janitor at headquarters or whatever, however you want to define the lowest tier, you're still saying that person would have 16 tiers of communication to go up to talk to the CEO. So even forget about how wide that gap is. Just like in the middle, there's all these, just to get from like a VP to a person that executes on business development might be 7 to 8 tiers. So like, it's really hard to be efficient because at some point a VP who might be like 3 levels below the top or whatever, he's going to have to worry about business development. But then the people executing on it are like 7 levels below him. To me, that doesn't feel efficient at all. But right. A lot of multi-billion valuation companies are structured that way, you know?
Yeah. So another question on this, like, so we're talking about people, right? And we're talking about the human aspect of leading people. And even just at a much smaller level, let's just talk about a team. And maybe that team is, 10 people inside the team. Might even be 5 people, but somewhere between 5 and 10 people. Let's say I'm a manager in that team. What are some things that I should keep in mind as a manager of that team in order to help my team be as effective as possible in making an impact on the business? Because I can't really worry about the 14 layers above me just because there's so much that I don't have control over. And I got to be really careful about the 10 layers below me. But in this specific team, what are some things that I as a manager can do to help be more effective with my team?
Well, first, I would say if it's for profit, just understand how the company makes money, understand where those pivots might be, and be communicating that to your team. Because that, in a for-profit context, a lot of times the only stuff that really matters or gets on agendas is about money, which is fine. There's no evil in that necessarily. But then if you work on stuff all week that has no context back to that, you can start to get depressed about your role. So if you're a manager, I would say constantly explain to your team, like, for better or worse, this is how the decision makers are thinking about the business. This is how, this is where the pivot points are. Here's some things that they're struggling with in their meetings or whatever. If you have an idea or solution to this, we can figure out a way to try to get that in front of somebody with authority. So just providing context for like how the business is working. I would say on a more day-to-day, week-to-week basis, one of the best ones I've heard, I forget the source on it, but I think it was like Harvard Business Review or something. But there's a manager who wrote some essay who was like, I just start every week with my team by saying what is harder than it should be or what's taking more time than it should be, and how could I jump on and alleviate some of that problem. So that I would say would be a great, simple managerial, like quote unquote hack that a lot of people don't use is like managers sometimes when they get to that level, they think they're above like the ditch digging style work. So they don't want to do kind of like crappy document updating or whatever. But it's really like empowering and respectful to people that work for you to be able to jump in on some of that stuff. So I feel like that's something just at a week-to-week granular level. And then final thing I guess I would say on this is like, obviously, American white collar is like notoriously bad about feedback and recognition. I would take the time to learn everybody on your 5 to 10 person team. How do they like to be recognized? Because some people don't like to be overtly recognized. Some people are cool with like a ton of Amazon gift cards. Some people want like team-wide emails talking about how great they are. So figure out how everybody likes to be recognized. And then when they're deserving of it, afford them that, because that's the other thing is that I think the biggest excuse we get around recognition is like, oh, it's too time consuming. It's time consuming on the front end because you need to know about your people and what they value. Once you know that, it shouldn't be time consuming on the back end. It's like any software program, process, whatever that you're trying to set up. Yes, normally on the front end, there's like a bunch of work and some growing pains, but like once you get it working, it shouldn't be consuming a tedious amount of time anymore,
Right. Yeah. So one of my takeaway from that is, yes, Ted was describing all of this. He started with questions like, how does the business make money?
Right.
What's harder today than it was last week? And how can we help get that unstuck or make that less hard or make it more simple or help it move forward? And how does my team like to be recognized?
Right.
And if you can start your week with a solid understanding of all three of those things and continue to iterate on it, you will be better as a manager. So let's flip the lens a little bit and say, as an employee, what can I do as an employee to help my manager be better? Or how can I be a better employee in the context of all of those kind of things?
Right. So I think this is like a really nuanced discussion because it obviously does vary within the ecosystem of like how your manager is and what they kind of want from you. Because you will land with some managers in your life who only care about like a specific type of output, and there's really no way to run around that. So in general, though, I would say as an employee, like over communicate just about like kind of what you don't know, where the gaps are, but also how you feel like you can contribute. Offer to step up on certain things. Those are two like generally universal truths I feel like that most managers are going to respect. Over communication is also good in the sense of like, this is a terrible thing to even have to acknowledge, but when you get to like a revenue erosion period with companies and there are layoffs, like employers will use like the most ridiculous like justifications to put people in a layoff box. So like if you're kind of over communicating and documenting in the process, obviously a lot of states in the US are at will or whatever. So it's kind of a non-issue to some extent, but it's harder for you to be forced out of a situation if you've been like over communicative and like generally document like the process and progress that you're making on stuff. So there's that, just stepping up and volunteering for things. And then I would say like, this is another kind of flaw with how work is structured right now, but generally organizations aren't super fond of spending money on training explicitly unless they're really flush. So you need to kind of like find ways to learn or better yourself to be able to take that next jump or level without necessarily them paying for it for you. So obviously like most of the last 4 years I've been freelancing, and I've had some like longer term engagements where I'm spending more of a week with a certain client. But like the first 2.5 years that I was doing it, like even though you can write off some of this stuff from a tax perspective, I would never do anything really to like better myself or whatever, aside from maybe like reading stuff online,
Yep.
watching videos. So then probably like a year and a half ago, and this is in part because I was making more money, so I had more personal financial flexibility. Probably like a year and a half ago, I would just like, if I saw a trade show that was interesting, like a concept I wanted to pursue that was being explored at some event, even if it wasn't in my area, I would just like pay to go for it, go to it. Because A, you can write it off, and B, it's like you have to just take chances on developing yourself because the organization's not necessarily going to do it. And if you do it while you're still within an organization, they might notice it and say like, oh man, that's a go get it miss by Mike or whatever. So I think those are probably the baselines employees. So then it's interesting because like you pointed out, to be a more effective manager is almost more about asking questions and like figuring out the context of a situation, which is different than how managers are usually trained, which is like get answers, be decisive. And then like stepping up for stuff and being decisive is actually like the employee side of the equation, but we ascribe it to the manager side of the equation. And maybe the fact that that's flipped is like one of the problems that we're talking about here.
It's kind of it really is. It's funny how we overcomplicate this stuff. And I know we've brought this up a couple of times as we've been talking. Right. It's just, we tend to overcomplicate this stuff. So right. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a bit about like onboarding. So what are some of the challenges that you're seeing in the marketplace today when it comes to onboarding? And then the next question I'm going to ask is how do we address those? But let's just start with some of the major challenges. Like what are some of the challenges?
What I've seen is like, this is about a year ago, this study that I saw. So S&P 1500, which again are big companies, but it was something like 22% had no formal onboarding process, which is insane at a company that size. And then 27% had no real way to metricize its success. So just between those two, you're saying 49%, almost 1 in 2 of the biggest companies in the world don't really know what they're doing around onboarding. That seems like a problem. I would say that at a big company level, and then I would say at a small mid-company level, I think the biggest challenge is people don't know what the focus should be. Most people seem to lean transactional. So fill out forms, get your desk, get a laptop, get introduced to a bunch of people that you may or may not ever have a project with. So a lot of people lean transactional. I kind of feel like, we'll get into this in the next question, but I kind of feel like switching jobs is like equivalent to like switching schools when you're a kid. It's the same type of emotional context. So I think onboarding should be a more transformative process, but it seems like most companies lean it towards transactional. So that is one problem. And then not being able to measure or document its success would be the other problem.
So I'm just a kind of country bumpkin out here in Arizona. What's the difference between transformative and transactional?
Okay, so I would say transactional is kind of like checking boxes. So like, here's all this stuff you need to fill out or get done, and it's mostly paperwork. Or you watch some static video of like the founder's son talking about the mission, whatever. So that would be transactional. So then transformative is like, I think they stopped doing this, but for a while, Facebook for onboarding, they gave you a dummy copy of the Facebook code base on your machine if you started in an engineering role. So if you push changes to that, it won't affect Facebook because it's a dummy copy. But still, they're basically like empowering you to like mess around with their code base and say like, okay, I see where this could be better. And they give you that on day one. So to me, that's kind of more like transformational. It's like, here's one of the 2 biggest websites in the world, 3 biggest websites in the world. You have a copy of the code base on your computer. And then second one I've read about is John Deere. When you onboard there,
Yep.
they give you like first of all, they give you a replica of the first like tractor they ever rolled off assembly. And then they give you like this whole brochure pamphlet about kind of like all the reasons that John Deere was founded and why they decided to be a company instead of just like independently producing stuff. And then you get this tractor replica. So it seems kind of like, you could say that it's kitschy or whatever, but it's like, okay, now you're like on your first day, you're being tied to like, why is this thing a business and how has it been around 100 years, you know? So that's kind of like something that could transform your view of the place as opposed to like, here's a bunch of HR paperwork. So I think that would be the difference there.
Those would be some pretty big red flags. If I joined a company and I was like, wow, I am going to make an impact in this organization. This is going to be awesome. And all of a sudden I'm just going through W-4s and I-9s and HR stuff. And I mean, I know you got to do that stuff. So you know, don't forget, I mean, you got to do that stuff. But if it's all about this kind of checklist and paperwork and check the box stuff, be careful. You might be inside an organization where the culture is a little bit different than what you'd expected. And, you know, when you're interviewing, I mean, what do you think about this, Ted? If someone's interviewing out there, is it okay for them to ask the question about onboarding process, like to describe what the onboarding process looks like?
Yeah, I actually think that's a good question because a lot of times when you're in those like 4 or 5 interview arcs and you keep getting put to other leaders in the organization and kind of the question base is the same, which happens a lot. I have a good horror story about that I can tell in a second, but like in all those interviews, somebody at the end is going to say, well, do you have any questions for me? And a lot of times that ends up being more generic questions. Like the candidate will say like, what's the culture? And obviously the person on the other end is going to say, oh, it's great. It's like supportive. It's collaborative, whatever. And then, you know, you get there and maybe it's none of those things. Hopefully it's all of those things, but it's not always. So I think that's a great question personally, because you're probably going to catch a lot of managers flat-footed in that they don't even necessarily know what the onboarding process looks like. And that's a red flag too. But if they do know it and they can describe like, oh, this is how we're going to bring you into our process and our culture and the way we execute on work, stuff like that, I feel like that would be a good sign to me. Like, oh, okay, these people like have it together for the most part or know what they're doing. So that, I think it's a good question. And a lot of times in those like phone interviews, in-person interviews, when you get to do you have any additional questions, it's kind of like a dead zone. So that's as good a way to fill it as any, you know?
Yeah, always be prepared. You know, like be prepared with those questions and realize when you're going through this interview process with folks, you're interviewing them too. Like you need to make sure that this is going to be the right place for you. It's the right fit. And if you start to see those red flags, trust your intuition. It doesn't mean that you make a snap judgment and say, hey, this might not be the right place, but dig a little bit deeper into those questions and ask some more questions to try to figure out if it might be the right place.
I don't think enough people realize that. And it's kind of almost the same with salary. Now, obviously, you can lose a job on pushing too hard on either of these things, but like an interview process is not a one-way street. Yes, like they're ultimately going to accept one candidate, but it's a two-way street in terms of you're vetting them too. And it's like, yes, on the salary side, it's a little bit less flexibility because usually a CFO or a CFO's department is going to define a range for a position. For lower positions, it's going to be more narrow. So you don't have a ton of flexibility, but salary should, at the very least, like beyond about age 25, it should be a discussion at some level. And I think too many people are trained by like their parents or past job experiences. Like the interview is about you being vetted, which is not true. It's a two-way street. And like take whatever the salary is just to like get in the door and work harder to aspire for more. A lot of times you're going to have to do that. I'm not going to sugarcoat that, but salary should be a discussion past like very entry level positions, you know?
Well, Ted, this has been a really good conversation. I mean, yeah, I know this is the first time we've talked with each other directly. Everything else has been social. So you talked a bit about this whole crossing the chasm between social media and real life. And I mean, the engagement has to happen. The engagement has to happen. It can happen in person at these conferences when you're working on your own education. It can happen through a video call like we're doing here. We're recording a podcast. What else would you like to talk about as we kind of wrap things up here?
Okay, yes. So I had a question for you because I feel like it comes up a lot and you have more of a sales, biz dev background. So I was curious your take on it. So one thing that I've seen recently with like maybe 4 or 5 organizations that I do work with is they are good at selling, okay, so they can bring in business, but their retention rate for a client at like the 6-month mark is crappy. So in general, where would you say the issue is there? Do you think that it's not relationship driven selling or the client execution teams aren't there? Obviously, you don't know the specifics of all these places, but I always feel that's interesting when a company can sell, which is a vital function, but they can't retain. So when you've seen it, what do you see as the culprits in that situation?
Well, I've got a couple of questions for you. One is, like, in these instances, are we talking about large companies? Are we talking about small companies? Are we talking about technology? Are we talking about, like, what? Can you give me just a little bit more context about?
So most are technology, like software vendor. I would say generally mid-size, maybe one large one, maybe 1 or 2 that are quote unquote like high growth in terms of year over year. So at least revenue is high growth. So that's the general ecosystem of it. One's an agency, which is like a little bit different of a business model. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that context helps. And and like you said, there's so many more questions that you have to get into to try to figure out or diagnose what the actual problem is or what the challenge is. But a lot of times when you run into issues where you deliver something into the organization, meaning somebody agreed on the other side that this solution is going to help solve a problem that I have inside my company. And I'm willing to take a bet. I'm willing to take some risk. I'm going to invest in bringing this resource into the organization to help solve the problem. What ends up happening is the product doesn't necessarily do what they said it was going to do. And it could be a product thing, or on the sales side, the expectations were not set properly, meaning the sales rep misset expectations on how the product would actually work and how it would impact an organization. So you could have a challenge around the product's capabilities to execute, or you could have an expectation issue from a sales rep perspective in the way that they managed those expectations. Sometimes sales reps can be really convincing, and that's not, in my opinion, my approach, that's not the right way to do business. You shouldn't convince someone that they should be doing something. They should convince themselves that they want to take this action. So, you guide them through the process, you set expectations properly, and you execute. So those are 2 pieces, product related and expectation related. The third component could be on the customer success side of things, meaning once you actually go through the implementation process, it may be too difficult to implement that product inside the organization, or something's changed inside the company. If that's the case, then you want to look at your customer success approach, how you engage with the customer in that approach to help ensure that you are doing the thing that you said you were going to do. And in the Catalyst sale process, we call this our confirmation step, which happens usually 60 to 90 days after an implementation or after the contract has been executed, depending on the product. But this is where we go back and we say, did we do what we said we were going to do? And so many sales reps miss this step. They sell the deal and then they're gone and they're on to the next one because they've got to keep hunting for new business and they're bringing in revenue into the organization. Somebody else is going to take care of it. But the reality is, if you're not going back to your customer and asking them that question, did I do what I said I was going to do? Then there's so much risk that you've got an unhappy customer that's out there that's frustrated with the challenges. And if they come back to you and say, no, you didn't do it, and here's how, then you can get into those questions around, well, how can I fix it? Rather than trying to fix it at a renewal period 9 months later when everybody's irritated or they've already decided to exit the agreement. So those are three kind of areas that I would look at, but it would, similar to the early part of the conversation, starts with those questions. We've got to ask some questions, get a little bit more context, kind of figure out what's happening and see if we can identify some patterns. If we're seeing things just continue, that pattern to continue to repeat, then we might have some trouble on product market fit. We might have some trouble on actual execution and expectations that are set, or we may have some trouble on some area in that customer success chain.
Right. Yep. I like that, man. I think all that seems valuable. Okay. So
any other questions around that? Or
I had a follow, but I mean, it might be too comprehensive within the time frame, but we can
go ahead. Fire away. I like it. I think this is the first time I can remember that I actually had questions from a guest. So heck, we could do this all day.
Do you think that, okay, based off what we were just talking about, do you think that short-termism, which is usually baked into sales, do you think that's inherently a bad thing? Because I could see how it's positive in terms of motivating people that are in conventional, like hardcore sales type roles. But then it's like you said, people forget that 90-day, 180-day check-in. Like, have we actually done what we promised? Because they're out hunting a new thing. So obviously a lot of people, that was a big theme in like the 2016 presidential election or whatever. Like, obviously a lot of people decry short-term approaches to business. What do you think? Do you think it's like, is it a black and white issue, or like, do you think sales should be like more long-term focused? Is that even possible?
I think, it depends. I mean, like it's so hard to answer those questions because it really does depend. There's a couple of philosophies that I try to adopt and that we coach clients on, and when I'm working with people, I coach them on. But it's number one is, don't let your problems become your customers' problems. Like, my customer shouldn't care that it's end of quarter or end of year. Yet all of a sudden we want to put out all these discounts just so that we can get something over the line. And then when it doesn't happen or doesn't come over the line, or we don't get the deal done, then we go back and we just tell the customer that the price has changed. And the reality is, if the price was good on December 31st, that same price is good on January 4th. And so my approach on this is I tend to take a very long-term oriented focus. I'm planning on being on this earth for a long period of time. I'm figuring that at some point in time, I'm going to cross paths with a person who I'm talking to today. I'm going to cross paths with them at some point in the future. And that could either be at the company that they're at today, or it could be with a company some other place, or it could be in a company that I'm at in some other place. But if I treat people like people, I don't let my problems become their problems. I listen to what they're trying to accomplish. Things tend to work out. So as a sales manager, don't ask your team to rob from Peter to pay Paul, because you're still going to have to pay Peter at some point in the future. And as we mix these metaphors, I think it's just important for us to say, what are the general objectives of the business? Why are those things important? And are we actually doing this for the right reasons? Are we doing it for the customer? Or are we doing it to try to drive forward our own agenda? And if you're doing it to try to drive forward your own agenda, you may want to check yourself.
I agree with that. Okay, that's all good. That's you and I are aligned on thinking around that stuff. I always just think it's kind of like people either try to make it too black and white or miss the boat or whatever. Because I don't think short-termism is inherently bad, but I do think, like you said, a lot of people in sales, unfortunately, make their problems or their pressures, they push them down to the client. And doesn't seem like a good recipe for a long-term relationship, Definitely
not a good recipe for a long-term relationship. And I mean, sometimes, so things change. Like, when we talk about in the context of sports, my approach, the first quarter of a football game is going to be a little bit different than after the 2-minute warning has occurred, especially if I'm either down or I'm up. And all of these variables are going to shift how you approach things. So we talk about it in the context of sales as a thinking process. Apply some thought, consider what people are doing on their side, and try to look at things through their lens. This gets into empathy. But if you do those things tend to work out. At least they have worked out for me historically. Well, Ted, I really appreciate the questions. Thanks for ending with that. How can people find out more about what you're doing, where you are, where to connect with you? Where would you like people to go?
So I'm on all the major platforms, I guess. Twitter, it's at Ted Bauer 2003. LinkedIn, it's Edward Ted Bauer. Edward's my actual legal name. I have like a personal Facebook too, if anybody wants to engage there. And then my main blog is called Context of Things, which is the contextofthings.com. I have a newsletter link off of there that I send out about once a week too. So that's another way to engage. And then, I try to pop on stuff like Catalyst Sales Podcasts and other avenues where I can. So you might find me in the broader world of digital around there. But those are the core places. Actually, I've been doing more LinkedIn posting probably in the last 3 to 4 months than I had in the last 6 years. So that's always a good place to get in a discussion with me too.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you everyone for listening to the podcast. Ted, thanks for joining us, and go out there, connect with Ted, engage in his LinkedIn posts, see what he's reading about. I know you're going to enjoy the Context of Things blog. And Ted, thank you for joining us today.
Yep. Thanks so much for having me, Mike.
Thank you for listening to the Catalyst Sale Podcast. Your ratings and reviews help other people discover this show. Please share this episode with someone you think will find this information valuable, and tag us at Catalyst Sale on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Instagram when you do share, so we can join in the conversation.